week's decision in favor of Comcast by a U.S. appeals court prevents the FCC from forcing internet service providers to keep networks open to all forms of content. The unanimous ruling frees broadband providers from FCC regulations of network neutrality or equal treatment of all web traffic. The FCC sanctioned Comcast for slowing user access to the illegal download site BitTorrent.
Thanks, Nehema. While the court's decision temporarily deters FCC regulations of network neutrality, it may also affect what websites are accessible through private networks such as Comcast. We are joined live in the studio by American University Communications Professor Christopher Simpson. Professor Simpson, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Some say this decision effectively removes any government enforcement of broadband providers. How will this affect users on a network such as Comcast?
At least temporarily, this decision gives very broad authority and flexibility to internet service providers. That means if they choose to discriminate against a site or choose to cut off access for a site, such as BitTorrent or another, then they can do that.
Right. In 2002, the FCC under President Bush reclassified broadband as an information service and not a telecommunications service. How do you think this classification aided Comcast in their case against the enforcement of network neutrality?
The FCC is the government's agency that is in charge of keeping track of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is what's used for broadcasting. And what this means is that this relatively new technology, the internet, is to a very large extent outside of the FCC's zone of authority. The FCC will probably not end up in that position over the long term.
Well, Comcast was arguing that it needs to regulate activities such as massive movie downloads in order to maintain network speeds for other customers. What is the next step for the FCC in order to prevent Comcast from heavily influencing web content?
Well, that's up to the FCC, obviously, but the gist of it is that there's several different alternatives that are being explored. One has to do with legislation, new legislation, and that's the most likely approach that the agency and Congress is going to take. The real issue that is at the bottom of this particular controversy, there's two parts to it. The first is that a relatively small number of very powerful companies control the large majority of traffic, the backbone type traffic that takes place on the internet. The other is that there are relatively new technologies that are called deep packet inspection. And what these do is insert a little bit of computer code in email or other kinds of traffic as it goes through the network. That computer code is used to identify a particular user or a particular computer terminal and for advertising purposes or really any sort of purpose at all. This means that from the internet service provider's point of view, this gives them much more leverage to shape the flow of data that goes through the network. From an advertiser's point of view, this gives the advertiser a great deal more information about who's using the network. From the consumer's point of view, this means that it is possible for either the internet service provider or indirectly an advertiser to capture this information about individuals on the network. So the ability to do this is what Comcast was insisting was their right as managers of the network. The FCC was resisting this. I don't think that issue is going to go away.
Great. Thank you for your time, Professor Simpson. Now back to you, Nehema.
Coming up on District Wire News. American University is suggesting a more eco-friendly way to stay hydrated, and it means getting rid of water bottles. A full report after the break.